Hello everyone, thank you for taking a few moments to watch this video. What I'd like to do within the few moments that this video will last is to help us set the stage for the next type of research that we'll have an opportunity to discuss. Now, if you've been trekking with me for the past few weeks, you'll remember that we've had an opportunity to investigate two different types of research. We've had the opportunity to look at survey research, and we've had the opportunity to look at qualitative research. And so, what I'd like us to do now is to begin investigating what we mean when we talk about experimental research. Now, if we look at the literature, and sometimes this will depend on the textbook or, again, the literature that you may look at, oftentimes we'll see the terms qualitative research and survey research put together. And if you happen to see these terms put together, they're oftentimes described as descriptive research. And the reason that you'll hear it described as descriptive research is because both of those types of research essentially focus on describing things the way they are. Now, the type of research that we'll begin exploring today doesn't do that. With experimental research, we're essentially studying the cause and effect of something. And so, if you're jotting down notes here, one of the things that I'd like you to make a note of is the fact that experimental research is the only type of research that gives us the opportunity to see if there is a cause and effect of something. And we'll talk a little bit more about that concept as we move through the next few videos. But the first thing that I'd like for us to do today is to begin by defining perhaps the most important term as it relates to experimental research. And that term is variable. And so if we ask this question, what is a variable? Here's the answer that we should give. A variable is any characteristic or quality that varies among the members of a particular group. So let's look at an example here for just a second. Let's ask this question. What is it that may vary amongst us as a group of individuals? So if we think about that for just a moment, we differ on a few things. One of the things that we differ on is probably age. Perhaps we differ based on our gender as well. Maybe we differ as it relates to things like the amount of experience that we've had. And so, of course, we could certainly talk about other things that vary amongst this group. But again, it's going to be anything, any characteristic that varies amongst a group of individuals. Now, the next term that I'd like us to look at is completely different from the term variable, and that term is constant. And it's just like you might think. A constant is any characteristic or quality that is the same for every member of a particular group. So again, if we ask this question, now still related to our particular course, the thing that is going to be constant or the same amongst all of us would be our affiliation. So think about that. Our affiliation here is Georgia College. Now, we could pick another type of affiliation. We could say that we're all affiliated with the College of Health Sciences. Or we could say we're all affiliated with the master's program in Health and Human Performance. So again, our constant is anything that's going to be the same for each member of the group. So let's take a look at the next thing here. And I really want us to go back for just a moment and talk about this term variable. Now, if we look at the types of variables that exist, there are two types that I really want to make sure we have a solid understanding of. And you may be familiar with this, but the types of variables that we have, we consider them to be either categorical or we consider them to be continuous variables. And that's going to be very important as we move forward, and even as you take the second portion of this course later on this semester. Knowing the types of variables will help you with statistics. So just a little bit of a plug there. That's something that you'll definitely come back to. So I know this is going to be very simple, but I want to make sure that you get it. When we talk about categorical variables, we're talking about exactly what it sounds like. We're talking about things that fall within a particular category. And so when we talk about these categorical variables, sometimes they may or may not be mutually exclusive. That means that you belong to one of these groups. Oftentimes, we can't say that someone is both male and female. So that's what we mean when we use this term mutually exclusive. Just in the same way, it's hard to say that someone can be both a junior and a senior at the same time. So those two groups would be mutually exclusive. And then there are going to be some times that categories are not mutually exclusive. Now, if you happen to look at the picture to the right here, we can see some examples of other things that are categorical variables. For example, we have different types of trees. That is a category in and of itself. For example, we have oak trees. That's a category. Looking at the next section here, we could put types of vehicles or aircrafts into a category. We could put different types of animals into a category. So anything that can be placed in a category, we call it a categorical variable. Now, on the other end of the spectrum here, we've got something that we call a continuous variable. And sometimes you may hear these referred to as a quantitative variable, but they essentially mean the same thing. So common examples would be things like your height and your weight. And the reason that we call these continuous variables is because they fall on a given continuum. And so when you hear this word continuum, what I'd like you to think about is really the word number. So if there is a variable that's associated with a number, we say that it's a continuous variable. So again, looking at the picture to the right-hand side here, we could put the price of homes or the price of houses on a continuum, because different homes or different houses are going to be different amounts of money. So that's a way for us to talk about things that vary based on that term, continuous. Now, the next thing that I'd like us to talk about is the types of variables that we most often look at when it comes to experimental research. So here we go. The two major types of variables that we'll need to make sure we have a sound understanding of are both independent and dependent variables. Now, an independent variable, and again, you may be very familiar with this, is the variable that the researcher is manipulating. In other words, it's the variable by which the researcher is introducing into the given scenario. And so we oftentimes say that this is the presumed cause variable. Now, with a dependent variable, we say that this is usually the effect of the independent variable. And sometimes we refer to this as the response or the output variable. So in other words, this kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier. Experimental research gives us the opportunity to see, does one thing or a cause lead to an effect? Now, give me just a moment here to set the stage for an example. So if you're writing, please feel free to write along with me. And this will make sense all the more as we go through the rest of this week's videos. Okay, so if you've written that, you can label this at the top. We're going to say that this is a one-shot case study. a one-shot case study. Now, you'll definitely come to learn a little bit more about this again in the subsequent videos, but this will kind of set the stage for us here. Now, with this one-shot case study, the T and O represent something. And so a little bit of a spoiler alert, we'll talk more about this later on, but anytime we see this T, it represents what we call the treatment. And the O is going to represent an observation. Now, here's an example to go along with what we've talked about as it relates to an independent variable and a dependent variable. Now, let's say, for example, that I am giving you some kind of energy drink. Okay, so that energy drink, because I'm giving it to you, and if I'm the researcher, that energy drink will represent the independent variable. And sometimes we can just say that it represents our treatment. So our treatment here is the independent variable, and we're going to say that this is an energy drink. Okay, so now that I've given you this energy drink, what we're looking for is to observe the effect of that energy drink. And so the term that we would use here to represent this observation is the dependent variable. And so we have to ask ourselves, what is usually the outcome? What's usually the response, or what's usually the effect of consuming an energy drink? Well, we would say that the outcome is that typically we have increased alertness. So that's essentially what we mean when we talk about independent variables and dependent variables. They represent a treatment and an observation from a given study. So let's talk about some other variations of the terms that we've looked at as it relates to the independent and dependent variable. Now, right before we get started, here's what I'd like you to do if you're riding with me. Let's just create a little bit of a list to the side here. We're going to label these as one list as the independent variable and the other as the dependent variable. Now, what we've said so far is that our independent variable is oftentimes simply referred to as the treatment. And we've also said that our dependent variable is oftentimes referred to as the observation. Now, let's take this a step further here. When we talk about the outcome variable and a moderator variable, they represent modifications of the terms that we've already talked about. So let's look at the outcome variable here. First, let's make a note that the outcome variable is essentially a type of dependent variable. So I'll underline that here for us. Again, an outcome variable is simply a type of dependent variable. So what we'll do is we'll come to the list that we've created here, and we'll just make sure that we jot down that this outcome variable falls under our dependent variable category. So we'll put outcome variable here. Now let's jump down to the next one real quick. When we talk about a moderator variable, this is a type of independent variable. So again, we'll underline this here. And so let's make sure that we capture this term under our list for the independent variable. Okay, so we've got these different terms here that help us to better identify different types of variables that we may come across. Now let's discuss it further. The outcome variable, again, is a type of dependent variable. Now here's what makes it unique. It is a dependent variable that is going to be quantitative in nature. In other words, it's going to have some type of numerical value associated with it. Now our next bullet point here kind of further clarifies this for us. Most studies that demonstrate having an outcome variable would have to have a categorical independent variable. So let's look at an example here to hopefully give us a little bit of clarity about this term. And we'll put this under our independent variable category here. Let's say that we're interested in determining whether or not the type or the category of fuel that we put into our car gives us better gas mileage. Well, for this particular example, our independent variable would be fuel type. Now, that could be things like our regular gasoline, mid-grade, or high-grade, whatever that third category is. Our fuel type would be our independent variable. Now, the dependent variable in this particular case would be our gas mileage. And so again, we'll write that here. So notice that for this, fuel type is definitely categorical because we have them in certain categories, and our gas mileage would certainly be numerical, or it would have a quantitative value associated with it. Now let's look at our next example here. With the moderator variable, we've already said that this is a type of independent variable. And so this is selected to determine if it affects or modifies the basic relationship between a primary independent and dependent variable. So let me give you an example here. Let's say that we want to see if someone's level of education impacts their spending. We could see, is there a cause and effect of this? So we could add another variable to this study to help give us an idea if it changes the relationship between these two variables. But real quick before we do that, let's make a note that our level of education could very well represent, again, a categorical variable, and spending would represent a outcome variable because it's got that quantitative value that would be associated with it. So again, our moderator variable here is another variable that we can insert into the study to see if it impacts the relationship between these two things. Now, one thing that I think might greatly impact the relationship here might actually be someone's income. So you might agree with me that, yes, your level of education may dictate how well you spend or maybe how well you save, but the income that you have would most likely impact your level of spending as well. So that's what we mean when we talk about a moderator variable. It's also a type of independent variable. Now, let's talk about another type of variable here. And this is a variable that in research we truly try to avoid as much as possible. And so we call this variable an extraneous variable. Now, when you hear the word extraneous, really what you probably think of offhand is the root of this, which is extra. And in research, we don't like things to be extra. So let's talk about this. An extraneous variable is a type of independent variable that has not, or we have not yet controlled for it. In other words, we haven't yet done anything to limit its effect. Now, this is something that we truly do consider to be a problem in research. And so we don't like extraneous variables is, I guess, what we're getting at. And so let me give you an example here. We'll kind of go back to something that we looked at earlier. Again, if we look at something that we call the one-shot case study, so remember we had our treatment here, and we had our observation, and we had the subscript 1 next to that. and we'll talk more about what that means later on. But let's say that we had the example that we looked at before. The treatment was some type of energy drink. And again, we're looking at the outcome here, which would be alertness. And so if you remember, we said that, of course, the alertness would definitely be increased having consumed some type of energy drink. So here's where we bring this concept of an extraneous variable. Now, let's think about this. If I give you an energy drink and see that you have increased level of alertness, I could easily think that it's because of this energy drink that gave you this increased level of alertness. But it's possible that there were some other things that happened outside of this particular experiment that led to you having increased level of alertness. What if, and this is just very hypothetical for this particular example, but what if something extraneous happened where maybe you had already had an energy drink? If you had already had an energy drink, of course, your level of alertness is going to be through the roof. So having had that second energy drink might throw me off from saying that the one I gave you was truly the cause of you having an increased level of alertness. We really wouldn't be able to make that case much anymore. We would then have to shift to saying, well, your increased level of alertness probably came from 2 energy drinks. And we can give another example. We could say that another extraneous variable that gave you an increased level of alertness is the fact that maybe you got 8 hours of sleep last night. And so maybe you hadn't gotten that much sleep before. And so you felt very alert, you felt well rested, and you were just ready to go. That's another variable that impacts our ability to say that one thing has caused another thing. So again, we'll jot that down here, that again, maybe the extraneous variable is that you got 8 hours of sleep. So again, these are things that we don't particularly like in experimental research because they impede our ability to say that one thing has caused another thing. Now, continuing to talk about variables, here's another component that I'd like you to understand. When we talk about variables, we can further qualify them by saying that variables have levels. And so what we mean by that is that each independent and dependent variable may have something that further describes it. So again, if you're writing with me, if you want to just jot this down for note-taking purposes, that levels further describe the variable. So when we talk about these levels here, again, they further describe the variable that we're interested in. So let's look at an example here and talk about the levels of a variable that we might call academic standing or academic classification. So if you were an undergrad, people probably ask you this all the time, are you a freshman, sophomore, junior, or senior? And of course, you would respond here based on what your classification was. And so that classification could have been one of 4 particular options. It could have been freshman, sophomore, junior, and of course, senior. Now, some of us might say, yeah, I was definitely a super senior. Maybe you had an additional senior semester or something like that. But these are the typical categories that we use to represent academic standing or academic classification. And so here's what I'm getting at. These things are the levels of academic standing. Now let's do the same here for a dependent variable. Our dependent variables can also have levels, again, things that further describe what they are. So if I were to ask you this, what are the potential levels of grade point average? Well, you probably can knock this out of the park. It would be things like our 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, and then 4.0. These are levels that correspond to what we mean when we talk about grade point average. Now, let's give ourselves just a few examples here to practice and see if we can identify the independent and or dependent variables in the following scenarios. Here it is. The purpose of this study is to examine if the running surface impacted the running speed during intermittent bouts of speed training. Take just a second, feel free to pause the video here and see if you can identify what the independent and or dependent variable is in this scenario. So here it is. Let's look at it. If we're looking at the independent variable for this particular scenario, the independent variable here will definitely be running surface. Now, let's go to the next part. What would be the dependent variable? And probably you got this right. This would be running speed. So here's what we're doing. We're trying to see, does this cause running surface lead to a certain effect? Does running surface impact running speed? And essentially, I think we could say that it certainly does. Now, let's go one step further, and you may have already been thinking about this, but if we are to look back at the independent variable here, which again is running surface, and if we look at the picture to the right, we could also ask the question, what are the levels of this variable? And so I know it may be a little hard to see, but here it seems like we've got a grassy area. Here we've got a track. Here we're having someone run in the sand. And then here we've got someone on the road. And then here we've got a treadmill. So those would represent our levels for that particular variable. Now, for running speed, we could make a case that we could have levels to it, just depending on what the outcome of our study was. But again, it's going to be helpful for us to try to identify both the levels for an independent and a dependent variable. Here's the next one. The purpose of this study was to determine the impact of participants' social support networks on the therapeutic gains of an adventure therapy program. Again, feel free to pause the video here, see if you can identify the independent and the dependent variable. So here it is. You've probably gotten this correct too. Our independent variable here will be the social support network. And I'll just abbreviate there. Our independent variable is the social support network. And the dependent variable here would be the therapeutic gains from an adventure therapy program. So again, this is how we go about identifying variables. And if we wanted to take a step further, we could also do the same thing and see if we can identify the levels of these particular variables. And so again, if we're looking at the picture to the right, I know this may be a little hard to see, but for someone's social support network, the levels could be looking at mentors. It could be work companions or work friends. Another one could be a social media support network. And so we could go on and on here. Technical supporters and close friends and family. And then local associations. So in other words, we're looking to see, do these different levels of that variable, do they impact the therapeutic gains that would be acquired in an adventure therapy program? And again, we can also identify the levels of this variable just depending upon the way that the variable is derived. So that's essentially it for this video. I hope it's been helpful in giving you an idea about how we can understand variables for experimental research.